The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I will continue sharing with you some of the words of Musō Soseki, the eminent priest and great harmonizer from the 13th century in Japan. 14th century? Well, at any rate. As you've heard, he was the teacher to 7 emperors in Japan. And he also brought squabbling and even warring factions together, at least briefly, multiple times. And he was famous for his beautiful Japanese garden designs, and none of which are still existing in their original form. I believe all but one of them still exist, but in having been rebuilt because of the violence that erupted in the intervening centuries. And they are quite beautiful. This book that I'm going to be sharing from, called Dialogues of a Dream, is largely a catalog of his questions asked of him by students, notably the Ashikaga brothers, one of whom was well, they were both samurai, but one of whom was the shogun. And the other, apparently, the younger brother, was the mastermind and the strategist behind his older brother's work. Most of the questions and answers in here really have the flavor of the era and of the Japanese culture. But here and there are some that are relevant to us. And I'd like to share a couple of them today here. And in the first one, someone asks him, if you let go of everything and hold no thoughts in your mind of either the Buddha Dharma or the affairs of the world, would this be called the ground of original nature? And I say this, share this question because it is a mind state that many people can mistakenly find themselves in. Going back to our childhood, we all are learning, have learned, hopefully, maybe not, maybe we're still in the process of learning how to work with emotions, difficult feelings, and so on. And most people don't know how to deal with those. Psychology is beginning to catch up with an understanding of how to work with these difficult feelings. But still, when you think about the scroll that is over on the wall in the dining hall at Hidden Valley Zen Center in Southern California, that was brushed by one of the head abbots of a major Rinzai monastery in Japan in the 20th century. And it says, although the 8 winds may blow, it is not disturbed. Although the 8 winds may blow, it is not disturbed. And people can assume that what that means is you're just neutral. And it's a lot deeper than that. When we are truly not moved around by things, in other words, like Jacques Lasserre after he had had an awakening experience in Buchenwald, who was experiencing a great deal of joy and peace, even though he was at the time living in a hell realm. As we grow up, our parents are not really excited when we act out the terrible twos and so on that most of us have gone through. Maybe all of us have gone through, where we get outraged at when we're asked not to do something, or even when we're tired and grumpy. And the parents don't normally know what to do with a child at that point. All they know is to emphasize that the kid is not to act like that. And children not knowing what else to do, and adults not knowing what else to do, shut it down by dissociating from it. And we carry that habit pattern through the rest of our life, unless we have the great fortune to encounter the teachings of Longchenpa, the Tibetan master who centuries ago wrote a wonderful exposition on how to work with these things, or modern psychologists. For example, Eugene Gendlin, who wrote the book Focusing. In there are some real gems as to how to work with these things. The important thing I'm putting forth about this is that when we get into a mind state that is described by this questioner, let's read it again. If you let go of everything and hold no thoughts in your mind of either the Buddha Dharma or the affairs of the world, would this be called the ground of original nature? And Musso responds, Bodhidharma said, quote, outside cut off relations with all things, inside have no concerns. Make your mind like a wall and you will certainly attain the way. Close quote. That is his instructions for how to come to awakening. Da Hui Zongkao commented, this suggests that dropping all relations and remaining motionless on the inside are the means of entering the way. If you regard this as the way of truth, then you go against Bodhidharma's true intention. What it sounds like in that questioner's description is something that modern psychologists call dissociation. We can, in our efforts to search out the truth in this invisible atmosphere, really. I mean, there's no serious guidance, no explicit guidance, maybe I'll put it that way. There is serious guidance, but there's no explicit guidance into how to come to awakening. And it's easy, particularly if we already have the childhood conditioning of shutting things down, to do that. But that is not coming to awakening. As a matter of fact, that's quite the opposite. It's kind of taking yourself off into a corner. This is not quite exactly what Hakuin inveighed against when he called out this cave of dead sitting that he felt that Soto monks got into, where they just got into a kind of a nice mind state and assumed that that was awakening, and they just kind of hung out there. We can also get into a mind state of I wouldn't quite exactly call it blankness, but like there's no emotion, there's no feeling. And it's not as if we're wooden exactly, but it's kind of a nowhere place. We're not living and we're not dying. We're somewhere in some distant mind state, and it's not practice. Practice is alive, and our life is alive. And as we experience different events in our life and in our practice, emotions can come up. Feelings can come up that are not particularly pleasant, that we don't want. And it's way too easy to deny them, to make our mind kind of blank, similar to what this man is describing, where we don't seem to have any inner concerns and we don't seem to have any outer concerns either. But that's not appropriate practice. That's not practice that will bring about results. How to work with these things that come up? Well, I would suggest strongly that everyone get a copy of that book, Focusing, by Eugene Gendlin. And there are other books called Focusing on the market these days, but it's the one that was written by Eugene Gendlin, who has since died. I think he was in his 80s. When he was a graduate student is when he wrote the book. I think it might have started as his PhD thesis. He was a psychologist, and the background of the book, as many of you already know, is that it had been observed for some time that in the psychological world, people could do lots of therapy and basically stay stuck. They could do a kind of therapy where you go 3 times a week, even that concentrated for 10 years, 20 years, and still stay stuck. They have a great understanding intellectually of what's going on, but no freedom from it. And yet there were other people who within the first 2 or 3 sessions with a psychologist or a therapist were freeing themselves significantly. And they set about to try to find out what it was that made a difference. And very fast, they found out. Because for a long time, therapy sessions have been videotaped. So it was pretty easy to go through old records and see how people were reacting. And what they discovered was that the people who were able to make headway with their issues were ones who were able to focus inwardly and stay present with what was going on in their body. And that's a very dynamic experience if anybody has tried it. It's not what was talked about in this book with not having any feelings one way or the other. It's a very dynamic experience. And in a nutshell, if you have a difficult feeling coming up, what you do is you tune into what Gendlin termed the felt sense. And that is the experience of the energy that we usually try to escape from. And it goes up into our heads, and we create an emotion and a story around it. And the story often will keep the whole emotional thing going. But if we tune in as this energy is beginning to arise, doesn't matter what it is, it can be rage, actually. That's a very effective way of working with anger or any number of other experiences, emotional experiences, fear, and so on and so forth. And then what happens if we stay present with that physical experience in our bodies and stay out of our stories about it and stay out of our history, then there is a chance, if we tune in fully enough, and this is the key, because it's possible to be aware of an energy in our body and still be half out of it, out of the experience of it, which isn't going to solve much, although it's a good start. When we are able to fully experience the energy in the body, what happens, in my experience, is that there's a sense of it dissolving, not going away. That's different. That's basically we're trying to get rid of it, which is not the same thing. To effectively not be caught by it, we had to feel it so fully that there's a sense of release, a sense of relief as it sort of starts to dissolve. And as we do that, what happens is spaciousness opens up within that moment, within that situation, within those feelings. And that spaciousness allows a clearer understanding of a direction to move in as a result of whatever brought the feelings up to begin with. So be very careful. I know that in my early years of Zen practice, I had assumed that just not feeling things was part of practice, but it's not. And that's only because that's how I dealt with very, very difficult feelings as I was growing up. And many people do develop difficult feelings when they grow up, particularly anybody who's reasonably sensitive, because we are always going to be bumping into people and things that are challenging to us. So that is the first thing I'd like to share with. And I'd like to read it one more time to kind of fix it into your consciousness. The questioner asks, if you let go of everything and hold no thoughts in your mind of either the Buddha Dharma or the affairs of the world, would this be called the ground of original nature? And the answer, Bodhidharma said, outside cut off relations with all things, inside have no concerns. What that means is not to go blank, not to deny, not to sweep under the carpet, but not to be attached to the results or the experiences. There's a big, big difference. One of them involves dissociation. The other involves actually being truly present. Dahui Zonggao commented, this suggests that dropping all relations and remaining motionless on the inside are the means of entering the way. If you regard this as the way of truth, then you go against Bodhidharma's true intention. And then there's another question. And this talks about the effects of practice. The questioner asks, there are people who lose heart because they've had faith in Zen and practice its teaching for many years, yet have seen no results. Others would not begrudge the practice if they were certain it would lead to enlightenment before they died. But they fear that the end result may be nothing more than a lifetime exerting themselves in body and mind with no liberation in the next life either. Is there any basis for such thinking? Well, I would say that most Zen students have that experience at some point in their lives, in their practice lives, of wanting to have some indication that there's something that is happening, that is positive, that they are making progress, that when you're in school, you get grades and you have tests, and it's very clear whether you have learned the material you're supposed to learn and how well you've learned it or not. But within practice, there are no markers along the way. And I remember a time early in my practice when I was seeing my fellow practitioners at the Rochester Zen Center being passed on their initial breakthrough koan. And me, I was still working on it. And I just finally, in desperation almost, went to one of them, my good friend Frank, and who had been passed on as koan, as his wife had been also, not just a few months later. And I said, can't somebody give me some idea of whether I'm even doing it right? And Frank said, don't worry, it's all cumulative. It's all cumulative. And so for a long time, we are working in the dark. We really don't have any indication of whether our practice is going in the right direction, although our teacher will let us know about that. But we don't know if there's any results because there are no obvious results. In fact, it can seem like we're going backwards because as we become more clear and more aware through the practice, we become more aware of where we're caught. And that can feel like the Zen practice is actually making us into worse people. It's not. It's actually shining the light on the truth and showing us where we are caught. And that gives us the opportunity eventually to free ourselves from those caught places, to let go and to become more free. The practice really is cumulative if we are working on it. And of course, it's easy to sort of wander through Zen practice. There are places in America we can do that. This is not one of them because we are asked always to keep going in our practice. And if we are getting down into a blind alley, I'm very quick to let people know about that because there's so little time in our life to do this amazing practice and to become increasingly free, that to waste time by just hanging out is really a terrible mistake. Not only that, it impacts other people who are practicing around us as well in a negative way. I remember in the years when we were doing the beginning of the Mountain Cloud Zen Center in Santa Fe. And at one point, one of our members was having a difficult relationship with his wife and needed a place to live temporarily, and asked if he could come and stay at the center. And we said, well, okay. And then a few nights later, we're all coming to sit the evening sitting, and he's leaving and he says, bye, I'm going to a movie. What kind of an effect does that have on the mind state and the commitment of people who really, really do want to deeply practice? Of course, we all have challenging times with practice. And sometimes we feel like we need a vacation or something, although that's often the best time to really dig our heels in and dive into the practice, even if it feels like we're trying to chew on a rock. It's important to maintain commitment. And this is why faith is such an important aspect of practice, because faith will carry us along. If we understand somehow deep within ourselves that there is something that we can open to, and that it will be important to, and it'll be worth opening to, even if it takes a long, long time. And about that, I would say this. It can take a long, long time But that doesn't mean that important work isn't being done as part of that process. An old Zen friend of mine once told me that after he'd been practicing for 13 years at the Rochester Zen Center, and he would come to every Sunday morning sitting and many sesshin. He was an art teacher, so somehow he was able to manage that, certainly in the summer, because he had time off in the summer. And he said, when he'd been practicing for 13 years, he went into Roshi Kapleau and said, I've been practicing for 13 years. I haven't had a Kensho yet. And Roshi said, 13 years? 30 years? And John said, at that point, it suddenly didn't matter anymore. And it did take him another 7 years before he had a Kensho experience. But when he had it, it was deep. It was deep. And Albert Lowe, who became one of the successors at Rochester, a Canadian teacher who had the Montreal Zen Center and has since died in his 80s, actually. He and his wife, Jean, were both in residence at the Rochester Zen Center when I was there as well. And Albert had retired early. He'd been a personnel manager at a major utilities company in Canada, and had come to Zen because it was plagued by anxiety. By the time I knew them, Albert had already been passed on his breakthrough koan and was working on subsequent koans, but Jean had not. And there were some funny things going on around that, heartwarming, really, in a certain way. In those days, the Rochester Zen Center, there would be 60 people in the sesshin. And when Doksan was called, the entire Zendo would erupt in shouts and yells and scrambles, trying to get one of those 9 places in the Doksan waiting line. It was chaos. It was terrible. And the Doksan waiting line, the Doksan room was upstairs, and there were this pair of double doors that led out of the Zendo. There were any number of different accidents as part of the rush. And we had to rush out the doors and run up the stairs. And at one point, everybody is screaming like banshees because the monitors had stirred up the Zendo ahead of time to give people lots of energy so they could come roaring into Doksan and hopefully into a Kensho experience. Thankfully, that changed. Not the Kensho experience, but the screaming banshees. And Jean was a little bit ahead of me in the rush, and neither of us were going to end up in those 9 seats, but she got to the top landing and she turned around and she said, "Stop." And everybody froze. It was kind of funny there in the middle of sesshin. Another time, Roshi asked her to give a talk in the Zendo. And I remember her anguish was palpable. She said in the middle of the talk, she said, "Can't somebody push my button?" Meaning trigger her into a Kensho. She'd been practicing, as I said, 14 years at that point. But only a couple of sesshin later, and I was in the Zendo at the time, she came down from Doksan and aloud in the Zendo, in great wonder, said, "Only 14 years. Only 14 years." So hopefully telling about these experiences will encourage people to keep going, because we're flying blind for a long time. We really don't know whether we're making progress or not. And as I've already said, this is why faith is so vital, and determination to go ahead anyway, regardless of what seems to be happening or doesn't seem to be happening. It makes a difference. It really makes a difference. Perseverance is vital in Zen practice. So let's continue with what Musoso Seki says. So again, the question: there are people who lose heart because they have had faith in Zen and practiced its teachings for many years, yet have seen no results. Others would not begrudge the practice if they were certain it would lead to enlightenment before they died, but they fear that the end result may be nothing more than a lifetime of exerting themselves in body and mind with no liberation in the next life either. Is there any basis for such thinking? And Muso says, when such people say they have experienced no results, even after long years of practicing Zen, what sort of results do they mean? Some people rush about the world seeking fame or coveting wealth. Some pray to the gods and Buddhas in order to escape disaster and invite good fortune. Some study the Buddhist scriptures and Chinese classics in hope of acquiring wisdom. Some engage in esoteric practices in order to acquire supernatural powers. And some practice the arts and other skills in order to become more accomplished than others. Some try various therapies in order to cure disease. Zen practice, however, is qualitatively different. Where would one look for results? An ancient master said, quote, "It is present in all people and complete in everyone. There is not less of it in ignorant people, nor more in sages," close quote. Another ancient master said, quote, "The way is complete like the great void, without deficiency and without excess," close quote. The way is completely like the great void, without deficiency and without excess. To think we've obtained results from practicing the Buddha Dharma is like thinking there's excess in the void. To think we've obtained no results is like thinking there's deficiency in the void. If there were truly some excess or lack, the words of the Buddhas and patriarchs that, quote, "there is not less of it in ignorant people, nor more of it in sages," close quote, would be untrue. Then there are those who give up on the practice before they even start, on the assumption that any practice they might do is wasted if it doesn't lead to enlightenment. Such people are the most foolish of all. If you entertain such worries, that what can you ever hope to accomplish, either in Buddhism or in worldly endeavors? After all, are there not people who, no matter how difficult the task, think through every possibility and exert every effort in an attempt to achieve success? People who quit before even giving Buddhist practice a try are those whose karmic burden has weakened their aspiration for the Buddha Dharma. If worry about whether the practice will ever lead to an awakening causes you to avoid it for your entire life, what will you do in your next existence? Do you think that if you fail to awaken through your own efforts, you can hire someone to have enlightenment for you? If another person's practice could bring about awakening, do you think that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the myriad universes would have allowed sentient beings to continue wandering in the realms of delusion? Those of us who come to Zen practice with a strong aspiration, and we have to be careful about what we think that means, because in the old days in Rochester, Roshi Kapleau would often say in Teisho that it takes three things to really succeed in Zen practice: great doubt, which I had no clues of what the heck is great doubt, great faith, and great determination. Well, Stephen Batchelor eventually came out with a book in which he explained what great doubt was, and it really is perplexity. It's It's a sense that there is something we don't quite get yet that is really important to comprehend, something, as one person put it, just beyond the veil. And hearing this again and again and again and again, I thought, well, I don't have great doubt. I mean, when I'm doubting, and I thought, I certainly don't have great faith. And I was worried the entire time I was at the Rochester Zen Center in the old days that somebody would figure it out and kick me out, that I was of a person of no faith. All I knew was I was darn stubborn. And I also knew that I'd had an experience some months before I ever started Zen practice that made me realize that there was nothing in this entire universe that would ever give me lasting peace and happiness that was outside me. That the only place I would find such would be inside somehow, some way. And because I'd had that very, very strong realization, I guess you would call it that, I was willing to undergo the stresses and challenges of my earlier years in Zen practice and stick it out, because I knew there was no alternative. I wasn't really interested in getting into drugs or alcohol or any of the other things that people try to lose themselves in or find some level of pleasure in. But I did have a sense that there was something within that if I could only touch it, it would be transformative. It would reveal joy, happiness, ease, peace at last. And it's true. It is true. And if we're fortunate enough to have had an experience that really teaches us that there is nothing outside that will make us happy in the long run, temporarily, of course, lots of things, but they're only temporary. And the only lasting peace and happiness comes from within, when we discover who we really are and are able to let go all the sticky places, or at least enough of the sticky places, where we cause ourselves suffering. This is what Zen practice is about. And faith is vital. To have the faith that if you just persist, it will change. And you may be the last person to know it for a long time, but it will change if you really give yourself to it. And that's the key, to really give yourself to it. We can sort of wander through practice. We can, do some at a certain level and keep it at that minimum level. And not much will happen if we do that. But if we really give ourselves to the practice, it will make an enormous difference, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of countless beings, many of whom we will never meet, most likely. When Mitra-roshi was growing up, when he was a kid, he wanted to be a rocket pilot. And then he wanted to be an airline pilot. And then eventually he wanted to become a psychologist because he didn't like his personality. And so when he went to college, he majored in psychology. But at one point while he's in college, and he was going to college in Kyoto, even though he lived in Nara, this is quite common in Japan, where kids will go to school in a different city. It has been so safe in Japan that even grade school kids can go hop on a train and get off at the race station and get themselves to school in another city. And he was going to Hanazono University in Kyoto, which is a Rinzai University. And one day his father asked him to take some papers to a place, a temple in Kyoto. It happened to be one of the Myoshinji sub-temples in Kyoto, and so to go on an earlier bus. So he did. He got on the earlier bus, which was crowded in rush hour. Unlike in the United States, they'll have 2-3 buses in a row right behind each other to take care of everybody who needed to go in a certain direction to work. At any rate, he got on this bus and it was crowded, and he soon saw an older gentleman dressed in priest robes, which kind of surprised him. He'd grown up in a temple himself, in a Buddhist temple. His father was a Buddhist priest. He wanted nothing to do with the priesthood himself. As I said, he wanted to become a pilot or become a psychologist. And this man was very unusual in his deep quiet. It was a deep, perceptive quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that you heard described in this questioner earlier in the Teisho here. And he was fascinated by this because his assumption about Buddhist priests was the typical general assumption that most Japanese have, and that's their glorified funeral directors. And yet this man there was something special about him. He radiated a deep quiet and a sense of peace. Went to the back of the bus, sat down and opened a little book and started reading. And the young Harada was delighted when he discovered that the priest was getting off at the same stop that he needed to get off. Not only that, they were going to the same place, actually, which was, again, a sub-temple, Ryunin, one of the sub-temples in Myoshinji, which is the great Rinzai headquarters temple complex in Kyoto. It's huge, by the way. There are 44 temples within that compound. Most of them are not active these days. They were all sub-temples, and they were all teaching temples at one point in time. Myoshinji was established, I think, in 653 or something like that. It had been around for a long time. So he delivered his papers, but it changed his life. And after he graduated from college, he walked to Kobe from Nara to become a student of that very priest who was Yamada Mitra-roshi. And the rest is history. So our own demeanor can change people. That's not necessarily why we would practice. But practice makes a difference, whether or not we can see the results. So have faith, keep going as steadily and deeply and with as great commitment as possible, because it will make a difference. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.